for a world in crisis. And that, too, I think, is a marvelous choice of a title. It's Mr. Dewey's choice. Clearly, any policy of a great nation has to have a strain of justice running through it, often illuminated by its humanitarianism. And this topic, then, I think, is of great interest. It may not be the topic that's in the most urgent headlines, but it is a critical piece of our foreign policy. And to present it tonight, we have a gentleman who is deeply steeped in practical affairs. He's served in the military, he's at diplomatic posts, he's been with the United Nations, he's worked for non-governmental organizations. One thing I've often chatted about with friends is about all the wonderful things you can do in your life, but nature plays a trick and you never have enough time to do it. And however, Mr. Dewey seems to be fighting that thesis for 50 years. He's done a series of things with great intensity, all of which are of great interest. He's a graduate of the United States Military Academy. His master's degree is from Princeton. He was a White House Fellow. He later served as director of the Commission for White House Fellows. He's been a research analyst at the Institute of International Studies in Geneva. He's been a fellow with the Council on Foreign Relations. His military career has included a couple of tours in Vietnam, including commanding a combat helicopter battalion. He also was head of the Army's Bureau or Division of Political Military Affairs at the end of his career. He served as a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of Refugee Affairs. He then went to the United Nations and had a similar post, serving as Deputy High Commissioner for Refugees and as with the rank of Assistant Secretary General in that position. He later headed the Center for the Congressional Hunger Center, a non-governmental organization, and then for an interesting period of time worked with theater commanders in Asia, Europe, and Latin America to introduce or infuse political and humanitarian considerations into post-Cold War military training, a task which is hugely important and, of course, before all of us today. He was appointed to his present position as Assistant Secretary of State for Population, Refugees, and Migration in 2002. Almost 50 years of very impressive public service. It's my great pleasure to present Assistant Secretary of State Arthur Gene Dewey.
Thanks so much, Frank. It's a little bit intimidating. I'm here with at least two West Point classmates, and they both have PhDs, and so I'm sufficiently intimidated by that. And also, I have to say that you're going to enjoy the talk that Roger Noriega will give shortly, because Roger and I just finished a round of meetings and hearings on Capitol Hill on Haiti. And Roger sent me a note after one of them. He appreciated my riding shotgun with him on the hearing where the Black Caucus members attended, and really pretty much riddled both of us on Haiti. So I hope you have some hard questions for Roger too when he joins you. It certainly is an honor to be asked to address this distinguished group of community leaders. I know this meeting is important because of the significant role that you play in educating the public about foreign affairs. Almost every day, news of exotic foreign diseases and appalling ethnic or religious violence, or lost jobs to low wages, or America's image in the world, those things fill our headlines. It is hard to make sense of it all, but it has never been more important to try. I would say that it's the best and the worst of times to be in government. It's the best of times to be in the State Department because I don't think we've ever had a constellation of leadership of the kind we have today. With Colin Powell as Secretary and Rich Armitage as Deputy, it's an extraordinary constellation at the top. and their troop-leading procedure, which infuses that whole organization, is really something to behold. Morale has never been as high. But it's also the worst of times, given the asymmetry of the worldwide war on terror, the horrible asymmetry of the war that we're facing today. You are deeply concerned, I'm sure, about how, amid so much chaos and confusion, our country defines and manages its place in the world and promotes our national interest and prosperity. I know you share our concerns in finding pragmatic, cost-effective solutions to international problems. And I am confident that you, along with most Americans, have a humanitarian impulse to help alleviate the world's suffering. The Bush administration, the State Department, and my bureau, the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration. By the way, Frank, you got it all right. It's it's incredible. I have to have a note card myself to remember some of those acronyms, but Frank had it right on target. These organizations have been presented with unprecedented challenges. From my experience of nearly 50 years, as Frank said, in government, I find the challenges unprecedented. They do come from brutal, genocidal regimes with ruthless international terror networks, and the root cause of many of our problems in the world is bad leadership and bad governance. We have responded vigorously and achieved remarkable progress, but the success is a contingent success. To secure it, we must take care of the conflict victims who, once the dust settles, must be protected from violence and disease, fed, and given a helping hand toward helping themselves and taking charge of their lives again. It is this challenge I would like to focus on, the worldwide humanitarian crisis, how to foresee it, respond to it, solve it, and maybe most important, to learn from it. More and more, what we once called the developing world is a world in transition. Those countries transitioning into or out of a crisis. I would particularly like to talk about how we can arrive at sustainable solutions to the problems of refugees and internally displaced persons in this world in transition. To begin, let me say as clearly as I can that the humanitarian dimension is at the forefront of American policy. You wouldn't believe that if you listened to some of the media reports. But having been and seen firsthand the motivations of our president and seen and heard him firsthand express his views on humanitarian issues, I can say that with total confidence. Our greatness is also based in large measure on our compassion, our sense of justice and insistence on human rights and human dignity for everyone. More than in any other country in the world, these principles are factored into decisions we take or do not take in the conduct of international affairs, the humanitarian dimension of statecraft. We are, after all, a nation of refugees and immigrants. So it is not surprising that the United States is a global leader in assistance to refugees and other victims of man-made disasters. My bureau is the major supporter of organizations such as the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees and the International Committee of the Red Cross. We have a budget of more than $800 million per year, which is huge by State Department terms, not big at all by defense terms, but big for us. And we use that to support programs and to influence policies that create the conditions in which refugees and other people in need can be protected and ultimately repatriated or resettled. Our preferred choice is always voluntary repatriation back to their country of origin, but where that is not possible, we, the United States, have opened our doors to admitting them to our country. This country, even after 9/11, offers a new home to more refugees each year than all of the other 9 resettlement countries in the world combined. Whenever I'm criticized about not bringing enough refugees into this country, and that happens quite often, it happens from high levels of our government, who tend to measure our success by how many refugees we bring into the United States. And we can bring up to a ceiling of 70,000 each year. But in the 2 years after 9/11, we brought in 27,000 and 28,000 respectively. So there, by that measurement, I'm really failing in demonstrating sufficient compassion. But when those criticisms come, one of the answers is that despite the stringent security measures that have had to be put in place after 9/11, we still admit more refugees than all of the other countries in the world combined. A former Secretary of State described the United States as the single indispensable state after the end of the Cold War. I would modify the popular interpretation of that statement just a bit to say that we are singly indispensable in today's world to the extent that we can leverage operations productivity out of the international system on behalf of nation building and defeating terror, and to the extent that we can leverage financial burden sharing from that international system on behalf of the American taxpayer. I have only two clients, the victims of man-made disasters and the American taxpayer, and I'm very conscious of the needs of both and the need to meet those needs as effectively and as cost-effectively as possible. As the United States draws on lessons of past transitions from a military operation to an indigenous political authority, and look to developing a civilian capacity to facilitate such transitions. Notice I said civilian as opposed to the current military capacity that we're using for that particular transition, even as we speak. This is the sort of single indispensability that should be foremost in our minds. At this moment, we face a time of unprecedented humanitarian need. There are some 30 ongoing conflicts in the world and 17 multinational peacekeeping and relief operations. There are 12 million refugees and 25 million internally displaced persons in the world. The misery that they suffer should be intolerable to civilized people. I just came back from Colombia a few days ago, where I saw some of the worst misery I've seen in any place in the world, with the 2.2 million persons displaced by the civil war in Colombia. And left to fester, this misery can be exploited by those who do not mean us well. So it has never been more important to learn and apply the lessons from past crises to present and future crises. We have learned, although I don't use the term lessons learned, I use the term lessons identified because I don't think our record is good in learning these lessons. But we have learned something in Afghanistan and now in Iraq, just to take two prominent cases. We've learned a lot about how to respond to human need and create a sustainable solution to humanitarian crises. Let me describe each of these cases just briefly, and then let me suggest how we can use our hard-won lessons and successes to develop a model that can be rapidly tailored for future applications. And this will be a model that uses the United Nations and a multilateral approach as its centerpiece. Do these references surprise you, having someone from a government that is accused by much of the world as being unilateralist, when I use the term our reliance principally as a center of gravity of our humanitarian work, the United Nations? Well, let me explain why I believe in this model of multilateralism and why I believe our indispensability is tied to learning and using this multilateral system. First, with respect to Afghanistan. Afghanistan is not over the hump yet in terms of security and stability, but from its earliest stages, it has demonstrated the ingredients of success. What are these ingredients of success? An important one is the role of the United Nations, which the United States in Afghanistan has encouraged and facilitated. The Afghan government and the people are reconstructing their country and turning a failed state into an emerging civil society. UN agencies have played a vital role as a kind of halfway house, an engine for transition, to transfer this responsibility and power to the Afghan governing authority. The mechanisms used were a very pedestrian term called program secretariat, and nobody in our government paid any attention to this term until I went out to Afghanistan in the summer of 2002, and I saw that there was something remarkable happening, and that was the use of the United Nations, which had served as as the deliverer of most of the government services during the Taliban period. The Taliban had no competence except oppression and persecution. And so the government services that were performed were pretty much performed by the United Nations agencies working through non-governmental organizations. And I found that those agencies were back in place and they were performing those functions of government, but at the same time, they were twinning with these fledgling Afghan ministries that needed everything possible for capacity building. Most of them were about one person deep. And this process, this structure and process was called the Program Secretariat structure. And I was so taken by it, since I hadn't seen it used in quite this transition sense before, that I sent a cable back to Washington. And as soon as I got back, I discovered that both Secretary Powell and Deputy Secretary Armitage had read that cable, and they decided that this was something they wanted to pursue. And so for one reason or the other, they immediately sent me back to Afghanistan and said, we want you to support this and do your best to put the weight of the United States behind this transition. And so I was out there for an indeterminate period, which turned out to be 5 weeks. But this linking of skills and resources of international aid organizations with counterpart ministries, this twinning helped to build the capacity of the government to plan and to manage and eventually to budget for and fund the services that governments are expected to provide. Now, this wasn't a piece of cake from the beginning. The Afghan leaders did not immediately warm to a United Nations role. They wanted resources to go directly to their ministries. And they had excuses for that because they looked at the United Nations driving around in new cars, getting salaries that exceeded anything the Afghans had ever heard of. And so they saw this huge overhead as something that was sapping what they wanted to have done. They wanted roads, they wanted electrical infrastructure. And I sat in on a meeting with President Karzai when he said that you should have let us tough it out. Remember that hard winter, the first winter after the U.S. military effort started? A tough winter, and it was a huge logistic operation to get the World Food Program food into Afghanistan. Karzai said, you should have let us tough it out. We needed the money for something else. And I was shocked when I heard that. And I said, well, somehow we've got to turn around this attitude at the top of the Afghan government. And eventually we did, and even got to the point where the president and his senior minister, the Minister of Finance, were even praising humanitarian work and the United Nations. But this didn't come overnight. But now the time has come for greater Afghan input into recovery plans. We support President Karzai's effort to use an Afghan-led consultative group now. That's the successor term to the pedestrian term Program Secretariat process. But that builds on the old Program Secretariat model to ensure that international assistance is addressing the main objectives of the Afghan National Development Framework. The success of this approach that I have described has helped create conditions that allow for one of the largest repatriation operations in modern history. This is the 3 million refugees, Afghan refugees who sought shelter in Pakistan and in Iran to come back home. 3 million have come back home. This is a success attributable to American arms and diplomacy, and that success over the next 2 years has the potential to reduce the worldwide refugee population by as much as 30%. You don't read about that in the newspapers either, nor do you read about the difficulty in sustaining those achievements. And that's our job in the State Department to make sure that those 3 million refugees not only are able to come back home, but that they are able to stay back in their home. And then on top of that, there are about 500,000 internally displaced persons in Afghanistan who have come back to their homes. And so to sustain that success, we had to become creative and to develop some income-generating activities. My favorite example of an income-generating activity is a page we took from Franklin Roosevelt. You remember the Great Depression? Well, you don't remember the Great Depression in this country. But that Great Depression had the leadership of Franklin Roosevelt, and one of the income-generating approaches that he used was the Civilian Conservation Corps. And so on my first trip to Afghanistan, I saw the need for something like that for a country in crisis, in its own Great Depression, not even up to a Great Depression in Afghanistan. And so we started the Afghan Conservation Corps. This provides cash for work for now thousands of people, soon tens of thousands of people, and ultimately hundreds of thousands of people, including returnees from Pakistan and Iran, including the demilitarized militias, including vulnerable groups, including women. It's a wide net that this operation encompasses, and it's an extraordinary program. When I briefed President Karzai on the progress on this program last August, he responded not entirely in jest by saying, "I love this program, when it is my ambition someday to be head of the Afghan Conservation Corps." And he said that not totally in jest, because it does get frustrating to be on any given day the mayor of Kabul without much reach beyond the capital of Afghanistan. But it's Afghanistan's foreign minister, Abdullah, who gets credit for one of my favorite lines, and that line is this: refugee and internally displaced person returns are not distractions on the way to reconstruction. Refugee returns are reconstruction. This is a perfect example of what I referred to earlier as a sustainable solution. But this is never something we can take for granted. We have a conference coming up next week in Berlin, and our Bureau has fought very hard to keep this is on Afghanistan. It's a donors conference to raise money. And it's startling to see how quickly the donors and the Afghan government are starting to relapse into that old way of thinking that we're over the hurdle now. We can forget about humanitarian work and sustainment, and we can go back just to building roads and infrastructure. So it's been hard to get in that Berlin conference the humanitarian dimension. We've had to use some guerrilla warfare, to rely on some old friends who will be speaking at that conference, to do our best to get talking points into Secretary Powell's remarks, so that we keep alive the need not to forget what it has cost to bring the refugees back and what it's going to take over the next 4 years, 5 years, maybe longer, to keep them back in Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, then, the formula for success has been multinationalism and multilateralism. We ran into some difficulties when we tried to give unilateral responsibilities to certain donor countries in such key sectors as public safety and justice and human rights, where a close integration of efforts is required. You can't talk about police in isolation. You have to talk about police and justice. Police, justice, and jails, and a justice system. They're not separable elements. The way it was done, and this is one of the lessons that I hope we can learn from Afghanistan, and that is that it's better not to do it that way. It's better not to have donor countries around the table and parcel out sectors like you take police, you take justice, you take poppy eradication. But that's pretty much the way it was done. Rather than using the capacities that exist in the multilateral system to do those very things, and particularly to make the continuity and the merger and affect the synergy that is needed among those sectors. Now, in Iraq, we had to learn again, and I'll turn to that learning process now. This is a work in progress. We have helped Iraqis achieve dramatically better conditions today than they had since the early post-war days, when chaos and insecurity and the need to build up structures for assistance from zero or near zero slowed us down. And during that time, a certain amount of reinventing the wheel did take place as soon as we hit the ground. But that is not to say that we didn't plan well. and that we did not cast our net widely in the search for expertise and advice. Not maybe the problem was not that we didn't cast the net widely enough. We didn't pay much attention to the advice that we got, or at least some parts of our government didn't pay much attention to the advice that we did get in casting this wide net. We did plan well. No part of our government plans more thoroughly than the U.S. military, and the civil military planning for immediate humanitarian needs and for the transition was exemplary. Now, how do we do this? How can we say that civil military planning was exemplary when all you read about it in the newspapers today is how it's broken down and how insufficient it is? Well, we brought the United Nations agencies in from the very beginning of the planning process. It was in October of 2002 when I went up to the United Nations and talked to the person designated as the Iraq person in the United Nations, the Deputy Secretary General, Louise Frechette. And she was skeptical because most of the UN leadership was very much opposed to the war or any thought of conflict. And so her first question to me was, what are your plans for Iraq? And I said, well, our plans are your plans. The multilateralism for the United States did not stop with a 15-0 vote in the Security Council on Resolution 1441. And we plan to work with the United Nations in doing everything we can to avert a humanitarian crisis if conflict does take place. And we worked with each of the individual agencies of the UN, the operational agencies of the UN. Those agencies are the World Food Program, UNICEF, and the High Commissioner for Refugees. And to a person, they were opposed to the idea of going to war, but to a person, they did everything that they could do. They spent everything they had. They pre-positioned, they put their staffs forward, and this, more than anything else, is the reason we did not have an acute humanitarian crisis either during the conflict or after the conflict and up to this day. It is due, yes, in part to the speed of the military operation, but the knowledge that the people had that they didn't have to leave the country, they didn't have to leave their homes to find food and assistance, but that was prepositioned and would be coming to them. An interesting device that was used for the first time to bring together the civilian humanitarian agencies, and these are the agencies of the United Nations system that I mentioned, and the NGOs, to bring them together with the military planners. It's always been difficult, and it's one that the civilian agencies probably complain most about, that we're ignored. We're not brought into mission planning. We're not brought into the process of determining the range of specified and implied tasks that the military forces might be called upon to perform to support the civilian humanitarian operation. So we tried to correct that for the Iraq operation before the military effort started. How did we do that? Well, we went down to CENTCOM and talked it through with General Franks and his team. And then we went to, myself with an interagency team from Defense and AID. We went to Qatar and to Kuwait and met with the advanced military planners there and went through this range of specified and applied tasks that the civilians had come up with. These are areas where they said they would need help from the military or might need help in the military. And the military planners ought to factor in those sectors in their planning. And this was welcomed by the military planners. It was a first, but it was something which they could relate to and were surprised at. And in the event, we did catch most of the contingencies. The big one we missed was the looting of the museum in Baghdad. There were some other organizations that deal with antiquities that predicted that one and also pointed that one out. So really there was no excuse for missing that one as well. But that was a technique which I hope can be made stronger and used and be made routine for future operations to do that kind of accessing of the civilian planners and getting those results to the military planners. Though we haven't been able to use the Afghanistan model in Iraq, we are doing a kind of unilateral version of the twinning concept. And a major initiative by the Coalition Provisional Authority is underway to stand up new or rejuvenated Iraqi ministries by weeding out the incompetent and the corrupt and bringing in new blood. Coalition Provisional Authority personnel, along with U.S. and British technical specialists, are working closely with Iraqi counterparts in the various ministries. And my bureau, for example, is fortunate to have a very good minister. It's a minister of displacement and migration, very competent, Shiite, and we're doing our best to build up the capacity of his ministry, because he really is starting from ground zero with almost nothing, and we know that his ministry and his efforts are going to be crucial to a central factor in reconstruction in Iraq, and that is bringing back as many of those million Iraqis that were displaced by Saddam Hussein over the years, and bringing back as many as possible of the some 500,000 internally displaced persons in Iraq. We recognize that although it is late for a significant United Nations involvement in Iraq along the lines in Afghanistan, that it's probably not too late. I still have hope that even though the ground has been disturbed as far as UN involvement in Iraq, disturbed in horrible ways with the attack on the UN headquarters on the 19th of August in 2003, when my close friend Sergio Villar de Mello was killed. But there still is time for a significant role, a vital role, as the President has said, in Iraq. And as conditions continue to improve there, those who want to turn the country back toward chaos sense that their time is running out. Despite the recent escalation of violent incidents and the daily casualties, I firmly believe that those who wish us ill will fail. So what are the lessons that we take from these two case studies in particular, and other humanitarian interventions where we have been involved recently? I think the first is that the United Nations should be the focus of first resort, the effective center of gravity for the main humanitarian effort. The international community has given the United Nations and other international organizations, such as the Red Cross, the mandate to address humanitarian assistance and protection issues. Nobody else has that mandate. I don't have a protection mandate. I use and I make work to the extent that we can in the State Department, the protection mandate that the High Commissioner for Refugees possesses, and the International Committee of the Red Cross. This is as it should be. It encourages a universal approach and a burden-sharing approach. And as a taxpayer, as I mentioned, I approve of working through the United Nations so that the American taxpayer has to pay only 25% of the total refugee costs worldwide, for example, and we can count on the United Nations system to raise the additional 75%, and that to me is a good deal. And it's not just a good financial deal, or it's not just a good economics, it's the way the UN is used, the knowing where the hot buttons are, realizing that none of the UN agencies can be put on autopilot and expected to run by themselves, but through our system of monitoring around the world and working behind the scenes, we are able to get productivity out of each of the UN agencies that we fund. So it should be self-interest and interest in the victims of man-made disasters that drive us to multilateralism. Assistance and protection are met much more effectively when we use the mechanism of the UN system. Now, it's interesting that the Europeans who criticize us the most for being unilateral are actually the most unilateral when it comes to funding humanitarian operations. And I don't miss any opportunity to point that out. I just won't stand still for criticism of the United States as fundamentally a unilateralist government and a unilateralist administration, because I can point to the way European countries, particularly through their European Community Humanitarian Office, spend their humanitarian money. And they spend most of it directly, unilaterally, through non-governmental organizations and leave aside the United Nations system. They're doing a little bit better now, perhaps in some measure due to our continuing to talk and work with them. But remember that we are the consummate multilateralists when it comes to humanitarian action in the whole world. There isn't another country that can touch us. And we're not that way because we're idealistic UN huggers. Many of us don't particularly like the United Nations. But we do know how to make it work, and we see the economic advantages that I pointed out. Depending on the United Nations means that you have to learn it, you have to bird dog it constantly to get productivity, and you can never, as I said, put it on autopilot. But we must also recognize that while it doesn't make sense to replicate unilaterally the competencies that the UN already possesses, there are gaps. And one of the gaps is public safety and civil policing that the United Nations at present cannot fill. And in those cases, unilateral action may be appropriate, certainly in those countries that have a national police force, such as Canada and France, the Gendarmerie of France and the constabulary that Italy has. Second in my list of ideas and lessons that we can take away from these case studies is that the military should do what it does best, and that is to create the humanitarian space, the climate for humanitarian action, and not to do it themselves. The military should generally play a minimal role in providing such assistance, except in cases where a lack of security does not permit civilian organizations to do it. And of course, there must be a close collaboration before, during, and after a complex contingency operation between and among the civilian and military players. Unity of effort depends on comprehensive civil-military campaign planning. Campaign planning is something the military knows a lot about and does very well. There is almost no one that does well comprehensive campaign planning, which is using the total force, which is the civil military force. Now, the third lesson that we need to think and plan more for is the humanitarian impact of the decisions our government takes or does not take. Let's call it a humanitarian impact statement. We have an impact statement for everything else, for small business, for gender, for environment, but we really don't have an impact statement for people. We don't have a formalized way to take into account the humanitarian impact of the major decisions that we take or fail to take with respect to these major complex contingencies. How important is this kind of an impact? If you just look at the Balkans, the failure to assess the impact of not acting in the early 90s to ethnic cleansing in Bosnia should haunt us all our days. We also missed the onset of ethnic cleansing in Kosovo in 1998. And then with the NATO bombing of Serbia in 1999, we witnessed the cost of not acting on intelligence, that once the bombing started, a mass movement of people would result. That kind of intelligence was available. It was not shared with the High Commissioner for Refugees, and so she was not ready when that mass movement of people started. The United Nations couldn't cope because we didn't give them adequate information, and major donor states failed to contribute sufficiently to their needs. We did know better in Africa. We stood by, that is, the governments of the world stood by while genocide raged in Rwanda in 1994. And dithered on making preparations when we knew that the French pullout would lead to a massive million-person march from southwest Rwanda into eastern Zaire. The march that started on Bastille Day of 1994 and represented one of the biggest people movement in modern history and one of the greatest tragedies. The importance of having a humanitarian impact statement ties in directly to the imperative for integration and cohesion in the international humanitarian response, the need to bring to bear all the tools in the toolbox that are needed. But ultimately, and this is my fourth point, a sustainable solution depends on not doing too much. We don't want to create a state of dependency by doing everything and requiring nothing from the refugee or from the displaced person. We have to keep hope alive and we have to keep dignity alive. Refugees are some of the most unusual persons in the world. They have a creative drive and They have a particular characteristic that impelled them to move in the first place. And too often we kill that self-dependence and self-reliance. We do that by providing food for work. We avoid this dependency by providing food for work or cash for the work, as in the case of the Afghan Conservation Corps. At both the beginning and at the end of every humanitarian preoccupation should be the innocent victims of the crisis. Our responsibilities to them can best be discharged by etching the 4 lessons above in our hearts and minds. We bring to bear on their behalf the best competencies and resource mobilization when we act multilaterally. We provide the most effective humanitarian space to help them when we develop effective civil-military synergies. Third, our response to victim needs is more timely and effective when we factor humanitarian impact into all of our major actions and inactions. And finally, we best keep alive the victim's self-reliant spirit when we resist the temptation to do too much and instead help them help themselves. Let us remember as well in any reflection on our single indispensability after the Cold War, that we are singly indispensable to the extent that we are able to mobilize all the multinational and the multilateral tools needed to play a leadership role in a world where the threat is terrorism. And the mission is rebuilding failed states that will shut the terrorists out. Thank you very much for your kind attention, and I will be happy to take your questions. Thank you very much.
Well, we thank you for a wealth of information and for your insights. The question is, why a repetition of problems in Haiti and the necessity of an American involvement?
What happened in Haiti will happen again in Haiti until we get good leadership in Haiti. In the 200-year history of Haiti, it hasn't had that. And that's a lesson we need to carry back from Haiti, that it's the oppressive leadership. Even a democratically elected leader can be oppressive and dictatorial, and that was certainly the case with Aristide.
Would you comment upon the plight of the Palestinians throughout the Middle East and what you think should be done?
I mean, for me, they're no different than the Jews from that angle.
The assistance provided for Palestine refugees in the Middle East is a responsibility of our Bureau for the United States government, and we provide it through the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees. The difference between that agency, UNRWA, and the agency for the rest of the world's refugees, that is the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, is that the High Commissioner for Refugees has a mandate for 2 things: 1, protection, 2, solutions. The mandate of the Director General of UNRWA has neither protection nor solutions. Because when UNRWA was formed, it was realized that the solution to the Palestine refugee problem was so political, maybe the most political problem in the world, and that it didn't make sense to give a humanitarian organization the responsibility for solving that problem. So what do? We pretty much continue to put Band-Aids on their needs. And we can measure the success of the support that we provide through UNRWA, because they provide for education and they provide for medical assistance. And we can measure how well they are doing in both of those areas by comparing it to the persons who take the same tests in school in the host governments that are right beside them, and also the indicators in health. So we know that our money is well spent, but we also know that for the emergencies that have come up in conjunction with the Intifada, that these are very costly and tragic individual emergencies for Palestine refugees. And not enough money is coming in to fund those emergencies. And again, some of the countries that are all too willing to fund the Palestinian Authority, are really laggards when it comes to funding the humanitarian work of the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees.
How much has the cause of women been advanced in Afghanistan?
That's a great question. It hasn't been advanced enough. It's rare to find an Afghan woman not in the blue burqa. anywhere you go in downtown Kabul or out in the countryside. I went out to visit the major warlord Ismail Khan in Herat, and one of the things I had to talk to him about was the rights of women, and he was trying to tell me that this was the decision of women to wear the burqa, and I said, well, why don't you tell the women of Herat tomorrow that they don't have to wear the burqa anymore, and go on record that you are for the rights of women. They don't have to do it anymore. And he said, oh, if I did that, they would all show up the next day still in the burqa because they all want to do it. Well, of course, that's not the case. But this is the warlord attitude. We have to work all the time to make sure that the schools for girls stay open because they've been attacked in some cases, and there still is a lot of fundamentalist resentment. We're going through the completion of the Constitution. The Afghans are going through the completion of their own Constitution, and that's been one of the concerns, the rights of women, and trying to avoid the descent into Sharia law, which tends to be the temptation of most Muslim countries, and we're going through it in Iraq at the present time. So we have a long way to go with women in Afghanistan, and it's a preoccupation of our government. It's a preoccupation of the First Lady. Laura Bush is very concerned about that, and we're looking forward to the contribution she can make in dramatizing this need and this violation of human rights, which exists in all too many countries in the world.
The question is, does one take in too many refugees?
You know, I could go for 3 months at a time and never have that question raised because the criticisms that I get in Washington, it shows how insulated we are maybe in Washington, are you're not bringing in enough. The 27,000 in 2002 and 28,000 last year aren't enough, and we may not make 70,000 this year. So it is a good question because it does reflect attitudes in some parts of our country. Although as we look at most communities who do receive, even those either fairly small numbers that do come into the United States, 28,000 last year is pretty small compared to our total population, and compared to what some other countries in Africa have done for a long time, provided that first asylum for hundreds of thousands and even millions of refugees. But looking at the response of most of the communities where these refugees are settled, and they have settled some difficult refugee groups. The Hmong, the Highland Lao, is one group. They're used to a slash and burn culture, and they're very difficult to integrate. But they have done pretty well, and we're in the process now of interviewing Lao Hmong in Thailand for resettlement in the 4 states that have welcomed the Hmong. Another difficult group that my wife Priscilla and I saw in Utica, New York, are the Somali Bantus, one of the most difficult groups, and they're working out pretty well. There are some communities that express the attitude and the awareness that you mentioned. They don't want Somali Bantus in our.
Well, I'm not saying Somali Bantus. I'm just saying the overall number of people coming to the country, including refugees, and I'm talking about the population 30 years from now.
And let's not confuse refugees that have a definite ceiling each year. 70,000 is the ceiling that we've used in the last 3 years, and those who come in illegally. And there are millions of them. Yeah.
Would you comment on 2 matters? One, whether there is a difference between immigration requirements for Haitians versus Cubans, and then secondly, if you would comment on nation building in Haiti.
There is a difference. There is a nuance there between the way Haitians and Cubans are treated. But in both cases, those who do not meet the refugee test are sent back to their country. The test is, this is someone fleeing persecution and is unable or unwilling to return to his country because of persecution for his membership in a particular group or his or her gender and political affiliation. So that test is applied to both of them. But I've asked my people to do a better job of making sure that the perception of the way they're treated is also equal, that there is more fairness in the way those two groups are treated. I think there is room for improvement there. With respect to what we can do in Haiti, it's really disheartening to see the results of what we've done in the past. The $2.3 billion that the American taxpayers poured into Haiti in 1994 after Aristide was returned to power pretty much went down the rat hole. And it's hard to find anything to show for any of it. A lot of it was spent to build up a 5,000-person police force.
That's because there's also no accountabilities.
Yeah. And I come back to the point, when they have good leadership, Haiti will be a place where development can take place. And now it will take place in the ways that it has taken in very small areas and small communities where non-governmental organizations, faith-based groups, have in the past been able to make a difference by building up municipal councils or local councils of people who do take charge of their own future and use the inputs wisely. But the large inputs that come from governments have not succeeded, have not shown good results, and won't until good leadership comes to Haiti.
The question was for numbers of refugees, which you've referred to, and their educational levels.
This really varies from situation to situation. The High Commissioner for Refugees is responsible for primary education only. And so generations go by without getting secondary education or university education. The opportunities for education come largely through the resettlement to countries such as ours that bring them into the United States and give them that opportunity for an education. Some have been very well educated before they became refugees. In fact, they may have become refugees because of their educational level. And some Afghans and Iraqis are certainly in that situation.
If you are a refugee, how do you get things going on your behalf, and what countries do accept refugees?
The referral of refugees comes normally if you are an individual refugee, they are referred to resettlement countries by the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. We would like to expand that net, and so we have conducted training programs in Africa for non-governmental organizations to know how to do those kind of referrals. We've done that in large part so that we can have a wider reach and reach those persons who do need rescue and do need resettlement in some countries. Now, the other countries who resettle refugees, they include Canada and Australia. The countries most active and most effective are the Scandinavian countries, probably Sweden being at the top of the list. Norway does pretty well. Finland doesn't do so badly. Denmark has done well in the past, is now starting to lag. It's most of the Western European countries, but again, the numbers that they take in. I think for all of the European Union, last year it was about 320 compared to our 28,000. So if you compare the numbers, the other 9 countries in the world that accept refugees fall well behind the United States.
Are the Iraqis prepared for a conservation corps?
Well, we have one in the works. But you're right. Where you have centrally planned economies, where pretty much everything is done for you, as was the case of the former Soviet Union, it's a lot tougher. So I don't know how it's going to work in Iraq. We'll have to work on some microcredit schemes. We'll try to help liberate women, because women seem to be the ones that do best in microcredit, small entrepreneurial activities. So I think we'll have to tailor it very carefully for Iraq. So it's not like some other places where we're already planning a Liberia Conservation Corps where they need a lot of jobs. I just got back from Colombia, and there we have an opportunity for a real CCC, the Colombia Conservation Corps, where people do have a work ethic, and it'll work. But you're absolutely right. I'm not sure how it's going to work in Iraq.
Your question is, what's wrong with 70,000 immigrants?
Is there a connection between that and a population problem?
Well, we all know that there isn't a way, but we have a question. And is 70,000 too much? Does it create a problem?
Well, I really would like to get up to that 70,000. It would make my life a lot more comfortable in Washington, certainly as far as the White House is concerned. But these are not immigrants. As I mentioned, we get a lot of illegal immigrants across the border from Latin America. But and the immigrants are supposed to come in under a quota system. So many can come in each year through various ways, through a lottery system in some countries and different ways. So there is a legal migration channel to come into the United States. But the 70,000 ceiling, the 70,000 is the number of refugees, people who meet the 1951 Refugee Convention definition. That is, people who are fleeing persecution because of their membership in a particular group, and they're unable or unwilling to return to their country of origin. They are outside of their country, and they can't go back. And I don't think that 70,000, even if we were able to get up to it, and Colin Powell asked me about once a week how many we were bringing in. So I know exactly the numbers that we brought in so far this year, about 16,847. So when I give that number to Secretary Powell, he said, well, I guess that curve is going to steepen as the year goes on, isn't it? And I assure him that the curve is going to steepen because we're using some extraordinary measures to bring those numbers in. And it is an indication of our compassion, because many of these people would have no future, and they would have no way of rescue if we didn't provide this help.
Would you comment on the difficulty of creating standards by which admission could be judged and a specific instance was given?
That's an excellent question. I think we do need more flexibility, and I hope we can find it without changing the law, without modifying the refugee definition of the 1951 Convention. But that's a good example. There is also another group in Russia, the Meskhetian Turks, that came. They weren't Turks, really. They came from Georgia. And this group really has no future in Russia. They won't be allowed citizenship in Russia. They're not welcome in Krasnodar Krai, where they are currently living. They just are stateless persons. So this is a category of people that have no future. They're not welcome where they are. They have a kind of institutional persecution as a result of this. And we're going to bring as many of those as we can, as many of those who want to come into the United States. We are starting the process of interviewing them, and we'll bring them in. So that's an excellent point, that we do have to have that kind of flexibility in making refugee determinations.
Well, for sharing so much of your time, we thank you very much.
Thanks to you. Great to be with you.